Two Navy sailors are tasked to accompany a beautiful prisoner on the 4th of July weekend. However, their task is no easy feat since the wily jailbird is determined to escape the two men, no matter the cost. In the Navy barracks, sailor Eddie Devane wakes up excited about his impending discharge from the service. He goes outside and calls car salesman Stig to inform him he'll be coming by to get his Porsche later. Eddie then enters the inventory control building, grabs a vase filled with flowers, and hands it to a woman for her birthday. He then goes to his cubicle and tells his partner, Howard, to meet in the storage room. In the storage room, Eddie talks about his recent scam with a wealthy designer, but Howard admonishes him for putting himself at risk on his last day and vehemently refuses to help him out. However, Eddie claims he already transferred the funds, gives Howard the receipts, and swears that they'll be incarcerated if they don't push through with the plan. Howard reluctantly accepts, and Eddie hugs him appreciatively. Eddie returns to his cubicle when he's suddenly called into Master Chief Boggs' office, who assigns him to escort a prisoner from the Marine Corps base at Camp Lejeune to Charleston Bay. Eddie tries to protest, but Boggs insists since he's the only one available due to the 4th of July holiday. Later, Howard spots Eddie being escorted from Boggs' office by the military police, or MP, and thinks Eddie's been arrested for his scams. Howard goes to his partner's workstation to destroy the evidence, where he discovers a wad of cash and realizes Eddie's been hiding it from him. The MPs drive Eddie to a parking lot to meet Chief Petty Officer Rock Riley, who's busy fixing his vehicle. Eddie introduces himself and asks if he can use a payphone when Rory, one of the MPs, mocks him. Eddie responds with an insult, leading Rory to punch Rock accidentally when Eddie ducks. After realizing what he's done, the MPs flee the scene. Eddie tries to excuse himself to use a payphone again when Rock brandishes a gun, changing his mind. Rock makes him sign a document and gruffly warns him to stay out of his way. The pair then make their way to Camp Lejeune, where Rock correctly guesses that Eddie's been extorting money, causing the younger sailor to clam up. They then stop to purchase a meal through a drive-thru, where a grumpy server in a pig costume insults Rock for taking too long to order. Furious, Rock tries to chase after him, but Eddie holds him back. As they drive away, Rock grumbles about how people lack manners, but Eddie tells him he's no better at communicating with civilians and advises him to charm them first. Soon, they arrive at the camp, where Rock prepares his weapons and hands Eddie a baton, informing him that he isn't allowed to use it since he'll be the one subduing their prisoner when the need arises. The pair enter the prison, where they meet the Marine Sergeant, who's surprised that they're the ones assigned to the mission. Rock then excuses himself from the room, and while he's away, the sergeant makes Eddie sign a document. When Rock returns, the Marine voices his doubts about their capabilities and mocks them. He then introduces their prisoner, Toni Johnson, a sea woman serving time for desertion. The revelation that they're transporting a woman shocks the two sailors. A furious Rock attempts to cancel the transfer, but the sergeant refuses because Eddie's already signed the document. With no choice, they escort her out of the building. When Toni complains about the sunlight hurting her eyes, the enamored Eddie rushes to lend her a pair of sunglasses. Rock stops him from catering to the prisoner's requests and cuffs her before forcing her inside the van. The trio sets off for Charleston Bay, and during the drive, Rock scolds Eddie for speaking to Toni. Eddie attempts to read her file, but Rock forbids him, so he asks the older man what crime she committed. However, Rock shrugs, says he never bothered to know, and lights a cigarette. Toni starts coughing and claims to have asthma, forcing Rock to throw his cigarette out the window. Toni spots a billboard of a nearby diner and asks if she can go to the bathroom, but Rock denies her request. Eddie voices out that he also needs to go, and that they need to stop for a meal anyway. Rock concedes, and Eddie slyly winks at Toni, making her smile. They enter the diner, and Eddie quickly makes his way to the payphone while Rock escorts Toni to the restroom. She tries to beguile him into freeing her, but to no avail. Inside the ladies' room, they hear two women discussing relationship problems in one of the stalls. Sighing, Rock instructs her to keep the stall unlocked and exits to stand guard at the door. Toni then opens the stall where the women are but reveals one waitress, Flo, playing a tape recording of the conversation. The women share a quick hug, then Flo cuts Toni's handcuffs and hands her a waitress uniform to change into. Toni then exits the bathroom dressed as a waitress, asks an oblivious Rock for a cigarette, and leaves the diner through the door, which Eddie opens for her. Outside, Toni gets into a car and tries to drive away, but she crashes into a truck. Meanwhile, Rock discovers she's escaped, and the two men rush outside to chase her. They catch her begging for help from a man by the gas pumps, who punches Rock when he tries to get a hold of her. Irate, Rock shows him his gun, and the man finally backs off. Back on the road, Rock remarks how she's the first prisoner to try to escape him, so Eddie suggests keeping the incident from the report. The two men argue about how they each had a hand in her escape, when Toni says her time of the month has just started. Rock doesn't believe her and thinks she's trying to fool them again. Minutes later, Rock reluctantly buys tampons for the amused Toni and leads her to the washroom. Outside, Eddie fills the van's tank with gas. Later, Toni purposefully trips on the gas pump hose, dislodging it from the gas tank. While the two men try to grab the hose, she deftly stuffs tampons inside the tank. A furious Rock then orders Eddie to secure Toni, while he returns to the washroom to clean up. Eddie leads her back to the van, and they flirtily introduce themselves to each other. Rock sees the interaction and reprimands Eddie, but the younger sailor continues smiling at the prisoner while closing the door. Hours later, Toni and Eddie pester Rock about his wife, but all the older man shares is that he has a wife and son. Rock then takes a shortcut through an old mining road despite Eddie arguing they should have taken the long way. The van then stalls in the middle of a deserted road. The men try to fix the engine, and an argument starts when Rock touches the battery and is electrocuted. Furious, he decides they'll walk back to the nearest town, releases Toni, and hands her a pair of boots. Later, Rock spots a hill and says they should cross it to get to the highway. As they're traversing, Toni spots a broken danger sign. The trio wonder what it could be warning them about when the ground beneath them suddenly gives away, and they fall into a mine shaft below. The men argue about Rock's choices and are about to throw hands when Toni intervenes, suggesting they climb on each other's shoulders until she reaches the top. Suspicious, Rock refuses, convinced she'll leave the men in the shaft to escape. However, Eddie believes she'd never do such a thing, so Rock finally agrees. When Toni gets to the top, she asks them to throw their clothes at her so they can use them as a rope to climb out. Unfortunately, to Eddie's dismay, Toni ditches them and runs away. However, as she's about to reach the main road, she has a change of heart and goes back to get them. Later, Dwayne tows their truck back to town and invites them to watch the fireworks that evening. Dwayne drops them off at a motel and promises to fix their van by the morning. Rock then instructs Eddie to book their rooms for the night, while he calls Boggs and informs him of the situation. Furious, Boggs orders them to come to headquarters immediately since Toni's expected to board a flight the next day. After the call, the exhausted Rock thanks Toni for coming back for them. Later, while Toni washes up, Rock reads her file. Eddie returns from shopping and asks what crime she committed, but he doesn't answer, ordering him to watch her while he bathes instead. Eddie then scans through the file when Toni appears and thanks him for the dress he bought her. They then order food at a diner where Rock flirts with a waitress named Katie. Eddie suggests he remove his wedding ring, but Rock admits it won't matter because he's been separated from his wife and estranged from his son for years. Moments later, Toni reveals that she went AWOL when she tried to visit her delinquent younger brother, Bobby. When the military police tried to arrest her, she resisted and hit them with a tire iron. Eventually, she found out that Bobby died while she was incarcerated. Later that night, Eddie phones Stig, who informs him that Howard came by and took his car. Eddie calls Howard and tells him to bring back his vehicle. However, Howard mentions the money Eddie hid from him. Eddie tries to explain himself, but Howard ends the call. Unbeknownst to the sailor, Toni's been listening to their conversation on the other phone and learns that Eddie had scammed $150,000 from the Navy. Later, an intoxicated Eddie returns from partying with the locals, and Toni invites him to her adjoining room. She flirts with him, and the two make out. When Eddie realizes she's handcuffed to the bed, he grabs the keys from Rock's bedside, uncuffs her, and they make love. The next morning, Eddie wakes up and sees Toni escaping on a bicycle. He chases her outside without any clothes on. By the road, Eddie defeatedly watches Toni hitch a ride from a passing car. Eddie returns to their room to face his enraged senior officer. Later, when they're about to leave, Dwayne informs them that their engine stalled because someone stuffed feminine hygiene products in the gas tank. Meanwhile, the sleazy man who gave Toni a ride, Laszlo Durkin, introduces himself as a fashion designer and offers her new clothes to try. When Laszlo pulls over to grab the clothes from the trunk, Toni steals the vehicle and drives away. Moments later, Toni hits Eddie and Rock's van, causing it to drive up an artificial volcano in a mini golf course. The volcano explodes, causing the van to flip over and land back on the ground. When Toni sees that they're okay, she waves at them before driving away. Furious, Rock shoots her vehicle's tires, and they chase after her, demanding she pull over. Toni tries to run away on foot, but they catch and subdue her. Pictures fall from her dress, so she grabs one and starts sobbing. The pair realize that her brother's funeral is happening soon, and she wants to be there. The trio then returns to the van, and the men attempt to fix it. However, the hot-headed sailors argue and brawl all over the mini golf course as people spectate and cheer. When the exhausted men have had enough and lie winded on the ground, people surround Toni to take photographs, and she relishes the moment. Later, at a bar, Rock hands Toni a shot and encourages her to join the brooding Eddie at a table in the corner. Toni tries to apologize for fleeing earlier, but Eddie is too hurt to entertain the conversation. Then, Toni admits she listened in on his phone call with Howard. Eddie believes she'll turn him in, and they continue to argue until Rock interrupts. They return to the base, and the men hand Toni over to Boggs, who's shocked by their disheveled appearance. Boggs informs them that her flight's been moved to tomorrow before leading Toni to a cell. Outside, Eddie returns Rock's baton and signs a document. They bid each other goodbye, and as Rock drives away, Eddie looks back at the detention center longingly. Distressed, Eddie makes his way to a bar to drink his sorrows away. Later, the MPs who accosted him the previous day arrive. They hound the beaten sailor, who suddenly attacks them and starts a bar fight. Eddie escapes while other sailors throw the MPs through the glass window and onto the street. Later, the intoxicated Eddie tries to climb the detention center fence to rescue Toni. Rock spots him and takes him back to his house. The next morning, Rock wakes Eddie and tells him to get dressed. They drive back to the base in the van and watch the MPs escort Toni to a vehicle. Rock then meets up with a colleague who hands Eddie the keys to another truck. On the bridge, the MP's van stalls, so they phone for help. Rock drives by and phones someone. As the MPs wait for reinforcement, a bearded man arrives to tow their van and explains he's a private contractor. The MPs attempt to get Toni out of the van before it gets towed, but the man stops them and asks them to wait until after he's lifted the vehicle. The man then winks at Toni, who realizes it's Eddie in disguise. Eddie goes back inside his truck and quickly drives away, leaving the two MPs behind. On the harbor, Rock sees that Eddie's escaped safely, so he departs, leaving a box of tampons behind, the contents of which he and Eddie used to sabotage the MP's van. 1 year later, Eddie and Toni enjoy their drinks at a bar on a tropical beach. Eddie calls Rock, who's now retired from the Navy, to annoy him for fun. After they hang up, Rock smiles and reprimands Katie for wearing lingerie around the house, despite knowing his son is arriving soon. They passionately kiss before Katie leaves the room to get dressed, leaving Rock with a satisfied smile on his face.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.